Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The morning of September 11th, 2001 began like any other, a clear blue sky, a city waking to routine. Then, in the span of minutes, the ordinary dissolved into catastrophe. 4 hijacked planes turned into weapons, striking symbols of American power with surgical precision. When the towers collapsed, so too did the illusion of safety. The dust that rose over Manhattan would settle not only on the city's streets, but on the conscience of the world. Across the globe, televisions flickered with the same images. The fireball, the falling steel, the people running through ash. The world stood still. And then it changed. In Washington, President George W. Bush and his advisors gathered inside rooms sealed from sunlight, their faces pale under fluorescent light. They knew who had done it, or at least who they would say had done it. The name Osama bin Laden rose again from the archives of unfinished wars. Bin Laden, the Saudi exile who had fought the Soviets in Afghanistan, had long imagined himself as the spark that would set empires ablaze. For years, the United States had underestimated him, treating al-Qaeda as a network of zealots rather than a movement built on resentment and precision. But on that morning, the calculations changed. The world's most powerful nation had been attacked with nothing but knives, flight manuals, and faith twisted into fanaticism. Within days, the U.S. government issued an ultimatum to Afghanistan's Taliban regime: surrender Osama bin Laden or share his fate. The Taliban's leader, Mullah Mohammed Omar, refused. To him, the guest right was sacred. Bin Laden had sworn allegiance, and in Afghan custom, that bond outweighed all threats. What the Taliban saw as honor, the West saw as defiance. In that misunderstanding lay the fuse for a 20-year war. The streets of America filled with flags. Soldiers, reservists, and civilians alike felt the pull of vengeance. In New York, firefighters sifted through rubble for survivors. In Washington, generals dusted off plans that had once gathered in the margins of Cold War manuals. They would call it Operation Enduring Freedom, a name heavy with promise and irony. The objective was simple: dismantle al-Qaeda, destroy the Taliban, and reshape Afghanistan into something that would never again harbor terror. But the truth was less clear. Afghanistan had swallowed empires before. The British, the Soviets, all convinced that strength could outlast the land's defiance. Yet in the autumn of 2001, none of that history mattered. America moved with the certainty of righteousness. Its grief turned to momentum. It gathered allies, secured permissions, and prepared the first bombs before the leaves had fallen in New England. In the mountains of Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden listened to the reports through a crackling radio. Around him, aides celebrated quietly, believing they had struck a blow from which America could never recover. He smiled faintly, knowing that for him, survival was victory. His war had never been about territory. It was about awakening a response so vast it would consume its maker. That night, the world's skies filled with planes, some carrying aid, others carrying the weight of retaliation. And beneath those skies, in villages that had nothing to do with New York or Washington, people looked up and saw war coming again. When dawn broke over the Hindu Kush, the mountains caught the first light like blades. The war that would define a generation had already begun, its spark born not in Kabul, but in the ashes of a distant city. In the weeks after 9/11, America's grief hardened into purpose. The mission was no longer justice. It was annihilation. In Washington, maps of Afghanistan spread across conference tables, marked with circles, arrows, and names barely anyone could pronounce. Every decision, every breath inside the Situation Room carried the same intent: find bin Laden, destroy his protectors, and make an example of anyone who stood in the way. The first to move were not soldiers but spies. The CIA, resurrecting the covert spirit of the Cold War, deployed teams from its Special Activities Division, men with no insignia, no uniforms, and no limits. Their orders were simple: infiltrate Afghanistan, link up with anti-Taliban militias, and prepare the ground for war. It was intelligence by hand, not by satellite, bribes, whispers, and loyalty bought with boxes of cash. In Tashkent, a small team led by Gary Schroen, a veteran officer with decades of Middle East experience, boarded an old Russian helicopter bound for the Panjshir Valley. Alongside weapons and communication gear, they carried $10 million in bundled bills, payment for alliances, not soldiers. Waiting for them were fighters of the Northern Alliance, men who had been at war long before the Americans arrived. Their leader, Mohammed Fahim, welcomed the CIA not as liberators but as useful reinforcements. For him, the Americans were a temporary wind, the mountains, a permanent home. Back in Pakistan, CIA Chief Robert Grenier tried a different route, diplomacy cloaked in urgency. He met secretly with Taliban envoys, offering them a way out: hand over bin Laden, avoid destruction. For a brief moment, the Taliban seemed uncertain, but in Kandahar, Mullah Omar remained unyielding. "He is a guest," Omar said, "and we are bound to protect him." That sentence, spoken in calm defiance, sealed Afghanistan's fate. President Bush's ultimatum followed days later: surrender bin Laden and every al-Qaeda leader, or face the full might of the United States. Congress gave him sweeping authority to use all necessary and appropriate force. The countdown to war began, though the decision had already been made in spirit. Meanwhile, al-Qaeda prepared for the inevitable. Bin Laden and his inner circle left Kandahar, vanishing into the highlands. They split their fighters across the country, some to reinforce Taliban lines, others to disappear into caves and villages. Every movement was calculated, every retreat designed to preserve the myth of invincibility. "They will come for us," bin Laden told his followers, "and they will never leave." In the deserts of the south, U.S. aircraft carriers repositioned. Tomahawk missiles were loaded, flight plans finalized. The precision of modern war stood poised against a nation still bound by tribal codes and terrain older than history. Few in Washington understood that those same mountains had already buried the ambitions of empires. As the first American planes streaked toward their targets on October 7, 2001, villagers watched the sky turn white, then orange. The earth trembled as the bombs struck Kandahar, Jalalabad, and the outskirts of Kabul. To those on the ground, it felt less like justice and more like judgment. In the flickering light of the explosions, a new chapter began. Not a conventional war, but a pursuit across time and geography, fought in shadows, caves, and shifting loyalties. Far away in the White House, President Bush ended his address to the nation with 12 words that would define the years ahead. "We will not tire, we will not falter, and we will not fail." Outside in the quiet streets of Washington, the wind carried the faint echo of jet engines, a sound that meant vengeance was already in motion. When the first bombs fell on October 7, 2001, Afghanistan's night sky burned like a forge. Cruise missiles sliced through clouds, tracing arcs of fire across the horizon. To those on the ground, it felt like the heavens themselves had turned against them. Villagers clutched their children as the earth shuddered, while Taliban fighters, accustomed to battling men, not machines, looked up at a war they could neither see nor touch. In Kabul, the regime's propaganda machines tried to steady the population. State radio declared that God would protect Afghanistan from the infidels, that foreign bombs could not crush faith. But even as they spoke, their transmitters flickered and died beneath waves of electronic interference. In the south, fuel depots erupted like miniature suns. The Taliban's world was shrinking, one explosion at a time. In Washington, officials watched grainy footage from satellites and drone feeds. Precision strikes lit the map like constellations. Each white flash marked a victory, each plume of smoke a step toward revenge. The Pentagon reported minimal collateral damage, but in the villages, there were no distinctions between targets and bystanders, only the rubble of homes that had once stood for generations. For every Taliban checkpoint destroyed, another civilian family vanished beneath the debris. As American jets roared overhead, the Northern Alliance began to move. Armed with new weapons and guided by CIA teams, they advanced through the ravaged plains north of Kabul. Their morale soared. For the first time in years, the wind of war blew in their favor. They fought not only for Afghanistan, but for retribution. Many had lost families to Taliban rule, and now vengeance and justice had fused into one. Yet amid the triumph, uncertainty lingered. The Taliban, fractured but not broken, melted into the countryside, taking their weapons, their fighters, and their silence with them. They abandoned their barracks, their cities, and even their dead, leaving behind a landscape haunted by absence. To the Americans, it looked like victory. To those who knew the land, it looked like camouflage. In Kandahar, Mullah Omar rallied his loyalists in a compound surrounded by dust and faith. "The Americans have watches," he told them, "but we have time." His voice was steady, almost calm. Around him, young men nodded. They did not need to win today. Survival itself was a form of resistance. As the days passed, the bombing intensified. Entire valleys disappeared under plumes of smoke, and roads once traveled by caravans for centuries became impassable. In Paktia, villagers dug shelters into the mountainsides, carving new homes into the same stone that had buried conquerors before. Above them, American planes drew endless circles in the air, a mechanical halo that never rested. The war, still in its infancy, already felt ancient. It was fought with satellites and sermons, with dollars and devotion. One side wielded technology, the other wielded time. Both believed victory was inevitable. In the distance, fires burned through the night, too many to count, too far to extinguish. And somewhere beyond them, the man who had started it all listened from the mountains, silent and unseen. By late October 2001, the war had shifted from open bombardment to a hunt through shadows. Osama bin Laden had vanished into the spine of the Hindu Kush, a labyrinth of stone and snow that stretched like an ancient scar across Afghanistan's east. American intelligence believed he was hiding near Jalalabad, somewhere within a narrow wound of rock and ice known as Tora Bora. The terrain was both fortress and trap, a place where mountains swallowed sound, and time itself seemed to slow. For the CIA and special operations teams on the ground, the challenge was not courage, but geography. The men of Operation Jawbreaker, small units of paramilitary officers and Green Berets, moved through ravines so tight that sunlight rarely touched the ground. They traveled on horseback, guided by Northern Alliance fighters who knew every ridge and cave. Radios often failed, maps were unreliable. The enemy could be 10 feet away and invisible. Afghanistan was not a battlefield, it was a living labyrinth. Above them, the American war machine hovered with omniscience. Satellites captured heat signatures, drones traced every road, and jets flew endless orbits overhead. Yet, in that vast machinery, certainty was rare. Every shadow might be bin Laden. Every trail might lead nowhere. Intelligence came from whispers, and whispers often lied. In the valleys, the first alliances began to strain. Some Afghan commanders accepted American money by day and shared intelligence with the Taliban by night. They understood the rhythm of foreign wars: come, conquer, and leave. To them, loyalty was a currency, not a virtue. The Americans, driven by urgency, mistook cooperation for control. Bin Laden, meanwhile, was in motion. Accompanied by a few dozen loyal guards, he moved from cave to cave, leaving behind little but ashes and Quranic verses etched into stone. He believed his escape was ordained, that survival would make him mythic. To his followers, his disappearance was proof of divine favor. To the Americans, it was humiliation. From the air, the mountains looked empty, clean, cold, silent. But on the ground, men fought for every ridge. Mortars echoed across valleys once home to shepherds. The smell of cordite mixed with pine. Every step forward required negotiation. Every victory demanded translation. The Americans had entered a war of terrain and language, one that no technology could simplify. As the Northern Alliance pushed closer to Kabul, the Taliban front lines began to unravel. Fighters slipped away under the cover of dust storms, leaving behind tanks without fuel and bunkers filled with prayer mats. In the capital, fear thickened like fog. The regime's officials packed their families onto trucks bound for Kandahar, clutching radios that broadcast nothing but static. And in those last weeks before the fall of Kabul, the mountains seemed to watch, unmoved, indifferent. To them, empires were brief guests, each arriving with thunder and departing in silence. In the pre-dawn chill of early November, a U.S. Special Forces team reached a high ridge overlooking the valley below. The air was thin, sharp, and utterly still. Through the haze, they saw the faint lights of Kabul, flickering like stars about to fade. They didn't speak. The war below was still raging, but up here, for just a moment, there was only the sound of wind. By early November 2001, the roar of the American bombing campaign had become the rhythm of Afghanistan itself. Each night, the sky flashed with fire. Each morning, the ground bore new craters. The Taliban's grip was fracturing. Supply routes were cut. Commanders defected, and their soldiers, exhausted, hungry, and disillusioned, began slipping away in the dark. The war that once felt ordained now felt inevitable. The Northern Alliance, armed and emboldened, advanced from the north with a speed that surprised even the CIA. What began as cautious movements through mined fields became a rapid push toward Kabul. They rode on pickups and horseback alike, guided by men who knew every curve of the land. For them, this was not an American war. It was the closing of a decade-old wound. They were taking back what had been stolen from them in 1996 when the Taliban's black flags rose over their capital. The city awaited its fate in silence. Inside Kabul, shopkeepers boarded windows, families hid what little they had left, and the once proud ministries stood hollow, their walls echoing with the ghosts of forgotten governments. The Taliban's police vanished first, then their officials. By the second week of November, even the checkpoints were abandoned. As Northern Alliance forces approached from the Shamali Plain, Taliban resistance collapsed entirely. Fighters dropped their weapons and melted into the population, shaving their beards and burning their turbans. For years they had ruled with sermons and fear. Now they ruled only their own retreat. On November 13th, the alliance entered Kabul. The Americans watched from afar. There were no victory parades, only the sound of engines and boots on dust. The capital fell with startling quiet, like a building imploding inward. There were cheers in the streets, but they were uncertain, almost hesitant, as if the city itself was afraid to believe in freedom again. In Washington, the footage played like catharsis. Commentators spoke of triumph, of liberation, of justice fulfilled. "The Taliban are finished," one headline read. But on the ground, those who had fought longest understood something the headlines did not. The Taliban were gone, but not defeated. Their leaders had vanished into the south, their weapons buried, their silence deliberate. As night descended, Kabul flickered with light for the first time in years. Candles burned in windows where radios had once broadcast decrees. Children emerged into courtyards, chasing one another beneath the smell of smoke and rain. The war, it seemed, had ended in victory. But beneath that fragile celebration, a question hung heavy. Where had the enemy gone? In a narrow alley off Chicken Street, a man knelt by a broken wall, tracing the shape of bullet holes with his fingers. The sound of distant artillery rolled through the city like fading thunder. He looked up toward the blackened sky, and for a moment he smiled. Not from joy, but from relief that it was finally quiet. For the first time in years, Kabul slept, but not for long. In the weeks following the fall of Kabul, the world declared victory. News anchors spoke of liberation. Politicians spoke of democracy taking root. The United States had toppled a regime in less than 2 months, an empire of faith brought down by precision and power. But in Afghanistan, wars rarely ended with declarations. They faded, shifted, and waited. Beneath the headlines, the real war was already changing its shape. The Taliban were gone from the cities, but not from the land. Across the south and east, fighters hid their weapons and blended into villages. Some buried their rifles beside family graves. Others traded them for farming tools, waiting for the season to pass. Their commanders melted into Pakistan's borderlands, men like Jalaluddin Haqqani, who carried decades of guerrilla wisdom. The Americans mistook silence for submission, not realizing that this was the calm of an enemy learning how to survive. Meanwhile, Osama bin Laden had vanished into the folds of the White Mountains, near Tora, Bora, a maze of caves once carved by Soviet bombs and hardened by Afghan resistance. For years, the CIA had mapped these mountains from satellites, but the reality defied their screens. The air was thin, the snow blinding, and the passes so narrow that even whispers seemed to echo forever. It was a fortress designed by nature and memory alike. In Washington, the Bush administration moved quickly to frame the future. Afghanistan was no longer just a battlefield. It was to become a model, proof that American resolve could remake the world. Plans for reconstruction filled conference rooms. Words like nation building and democracy promotion replaced counterterrorism in official speeches. But on the ground, soldiers still moved through fields where minds lay underfoot and loyalties shifted by the hour. The CIA teams that had once paid warlords to fight the Taliban now faced a new dilemma. Those same men had turned into power brokers, controlling checkpoints, trade routes, and aid convoys. Afghanistan's warlords wore suits now, but their rule was unchanged. Villages loyal to one commander found themselves punished by another. The government in Kabul existed in theory. In reality, the country was a quilt of rival fiefdoms stitched together by American dollars. In early December, the Americans believed they had found their moment of closure. Reports came in that bin Laden's forces had gathered in Tora, Bora. Airstrikes thundered through the valleys, shaking snow from the cliffs. Afghan militias, paid and armed by the CIA, closed in from below. But the enemy did not break. They simply vanished into the white. When U.S. Special Forces arrived, they found tunnels still warm, tea still steaming, and messages scrawled on stone. "We are still here." In the chaos, bin Laden slipped across the border into Pakistan. The man who had drawn America halfway across the world disappeared into another country's shadows. The most powerful military on earth had won every battle, except the one it had come to fight. Back in Kabul, the Northern Alliance celebrated its triumph, and diplomats toasted to peace. Yet beyond the city's lights, American soldiers trudged through valleys where radios failed and the wind carried whispers in Pashto and Urdu. The official war was over. The hidden one had just begun. In the cold light of dawn, an American soldier stood watch outside a makeshift outpost near Jalalabad. Below him, the land stretched out like an ocean of rock and frost. Somewhere in that silence, the enemy was waiting. The soldier adjusted his rifle and exhaled, his breath rising into the air like smoke. By December 2001, all roads in eastern Afghanistan led to the mountains of Tora Bora. It was here, the CIA believed, that Osama bin Laden was cornered, trapped in a maze of limestone caves carved into cliffs older than empire. American bombers circled above, pounding the ridges day and night, turning the mountainsides into avalanches of fire. For Washington, this was the climax, the final chapter of vengeance. But the mountains had seen such endings before. From the air, it looked like victory. Drones traced heat signatures through snow. Satellites marked explosions as blinding white flares across black terrain. Every strike was followed by the same confident report: target destroyed. Yet on the ground, there were no targets left to destroy. Only rock, mist, and silence. The enemy had vanished into the earth itself. U.S. Special Forces coordinated with Afghan militias to close the trap. These militias, many loyal to local warlords, advanced through narrow passes under constant bombardment. They fought fiercely but with their own motives: money, honor, revenge. When the Taliban line finally broke, the Americans ordered the Afghans to pursue. But the pursuit stopped at the Pakistan border, where old loyalties resurfaced. The same tribal guides who had taken payment from the CIA now watched silently as the survivors slipped across the snow. Inside the caves, bin Laden's men endured airstrikes that collapsed entire tunnels. They prayed in the dark, coughing through smoke and dust. Bin Laden himself, frail and wounded, refused evacuation until the last. "If it is God's will that we die here," he told them, "then the mountain will be our witness." But God, it seemed, had other plans. Under the cover of night, he and his closest guards escaped through goat trails that no satellite could trace. They crossed into Pakistan, leaving behind a legend stronger than any army. In Washington, officials celebrated prematurely. The Battle of Tora Bora was declared a success. Hundreds of al-Qaeda fighters dead, their bases destroyed. Yet among those numbers, one absence went unnoticed: the man who had started it all. By the time the Pentagon realized the truth, he was already beyond reach. For the soldiers on the ground, the aftermath was grim. The air stank of cordite and rot. Snow melted into ash-streaked rivers, carrying debris and bodies down into the valleys. The caves, when finally searched, revealed nothing but scorched earth and scattered pages of the Quran. There was no body, no proof, only the hollow echo of another lost chance. When the final airstrike fell, the mountains went silent. Reporters called it the end of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But the locals, who had seen empires come and go, knew better. They said the mountains never forgot, and they never gave back what they took. At dawn, as the smoke cleared, an American soldier stood at the mouth of a shattered cave. He peered into the darkness, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. There was nothing inside. No sound, no movement, only the faint dripping of water from the rocks. He whispered to no one in particular, "He's gone, isn't he?" The wind answered for him, howling through the valley like a ghost too familiar to name. As the smoke of Tora Bora drifted over the eastern mountains, the war's focus shifted south, toward Kandahar, the heart of the Taliban's power. Once the cradle of their movement, the city was now a fortress under siege. American planes prowled above it, and Northern Alliance fighters advanced from the north. Every road into Kandahar was cut, every escape route watched. Inside, the regime that had ruled Afghanistan for 5 brutal years began to crumble under its own silence. In the final days of November 2001, Mullah Mohammed Omar, the one-eyed cleric who had founded the Taliban, gathered his inner circle. They prayed together in the ruins of a mosque struck by American bombs. His voice, usually steady, now trembled. "We will not surrender," he said. "We will melt into the land, and when they grow tired, we will return." It was not a farewell. It was a promise whispered into dust. By the first week of December, the last Taliban strongholds began to fracture. Fighters defected or fled, some crossing into Pakistan disguised as refugees. Others threw down their weapons and vanished into the mountains, blending with the same tribes that had once raised them. Kandahar itself fell with barely a shot. Its capture was reported as a triumph, but there were no banners, no parades, only the slow, uneasy quiet of an empire evaporating. In Washington, officials declared victory. The Taliban were gone, al-Qaeda was scattered, and Afghanistan, for the first time in decades, was said to be free. Yet in the villages beyond Kandahar, freedom looked much like defeat. American convoys rolled through streets littered with debris, past faces that neither smiled nor spoke. The locals watched in silence, uncertain whether the conquerors were guests or the newest ghosts in a long line of foreign wars. The Northern Alliance, flush with American support, moved quickly to fill the vacuum. Warlords reclaimed their provinces, old rivalries reignited, and the fragile idea of unity dissolved before it began. In Kabul, Hamid Karzai, a soft-spoken tribal leader from Kandahar, was named interim president. To the Americans, he was a symbol of democracy. To many Afghans, he was a symbol of foreign favor. His rule began not with an election, but with a handshake, and a security cordon of U.S. bodyguards. As winter settled, the war's front lines blurred. The Americans believed the fighting was over, but for the Taliban, it had only changed shape. Commanders who had once led regiments now organized cells. Fighters who once carried rifles now carried memory. In mosques and mountain villages, the first whispers of a return began. "They will leave," elders said. "They always leave." In the city they once called theirs, Kandahar's people tried to rebuild. The smell of burned oil still clung to the air, and half-collapsed walls marked where bombs had found their targets. At sunset, a boy sat atop a roof watching the last American trucks rumble out of view, their headlights glowing like distant stars. He lifted a shard of glass to catch the light, turning it in his hands as the sky darkened. Behind him, the call to prayer echoed through the ruins, long, steady, and unbroken. Winter 2001 arrived in Afghanistan like a closing curtain. The skies turned gray, the rivers froze, and the mountains that had witnessed centuries of invasion now swallowed the latest one whole. The Americans, certain they had won, began shifting their gaze elsewhere. In the cities, reporters filmed soldiers handing out aid. In Washington, officials spoke of rebuilding. But in the east, beneath the snow of Tora Bora, the war that was supposed to end had only learned how to hide. The valleys were littered with the debris of hasty victory, burned trucks, abandoned camps, fragments of munitions half buried in the frost. The air still smelled of smoke. For weeks, American patrols combed the caves searching for signs of bin Laden, finding only traces of movement. Footprints frozen in ice, a torn satchel, an empty teapot still warm when they'd first arrived. Every clue felt like a ghost, proof that the man who had started the war was still alive and already a legend. In Pakistan, bin Laden's trail disappeared into the borderlands, swallowed by the tribal belt where even maps dared not intrude. There, the remnants of al-Qaeda began rebuilding quietly, smuggling messages, money, and men across the frontier. Pakistan's military looked the other way, unwilling or unable to control the wilderness that served as their neighbors' refuge. The United States, still flush with triumph, convinced itself that al-Qaeda was finished. It would not realize the truth for years. Meanwhile, In Afghanistan, the first fractures in victory began to show. The American forces were few, barely a few thousand troops scattered across a country the size of Texas. They relied on warlords to secure territory, on informants to provide intelligence, and on money to buy loyalty. It worked, but only while the dollars flowed. The same men who raised their hands in allegiance by day sent messages to the Taliban by night. The Americans mistook temporary order for peace. Hamid Karzai, still new in power, tried to hold together a government that barely existed. Ministers were chosen less for merit than for tribal balance. In meetings, arguments broke out over who controlled what province, which warlord received which contract. To the Americans, it looked like politics. To Afghans, it looked like the return of the past. By early 2002, the optimism began to fade. Skirmishes flared in the south, roadside bombs appeared on patrol routes, and ambushes struck convoys in valleys once declared secure. The war was mutating. Less a front line, more a fever that came and went without warning. Soldiers began referring to the mountains by nicknames: the teeth, the spine, the graveyard. They had learned what the locals already knew. The terrain itself was undefeated. In one forgotten gorge near Khost, a U.S. reconnaissance team found a small notebook buried beneath the snow. Inside were verses in Arabic and a single line in English: "You will leave, we will remain." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. As night fell, the soldiers burned the notebook for warmth. The pages curled and vanished into flame. For a moment, the fire lit the dark like a flare. Then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. In that fading light, the war disappeared with it. Not ending, not pausing, simply changing shape. By the spring of 2002, Afghanistan had become a country between worlds. One foot in war, the other in the illusion of peace. The Americans called it reconstruction. The Afghans called it uncertainty. In Kabul, aid workers arrived in convoys, diplomats spoke of nation building, and Hamid Karzai sat in borrowed offices guarded by U.S. Marines. On paper, Afghanistan had a government, a flag, even a plan. But outside the capital, power still belonged to the men with guns and the valleys that obeyed no one. The United States moved quickly to define its success. Television crews filmed school openings, new police recruits, and smiling children waving American flags. The images were powerful, proof that democracy was on the march. But behind those images, corruption bloomed like a second harvest. U.S. cash flooded the country faster than it could be spent. Contracts went to warlords. Aid shipments vanished on the road. In villages where promises replaced policy, locals began asking quietly what had really changed. The Taliban, scattered but not destroyed, listened from exile. Their commanders met in the shadows of Quetta and Peshawar, whispering of regrouping. They didn't need armies anymore, only patience. "The Americans will grow tired," one mullah said. "They always do." Across the border, fighters trained with what weapons they had left, certain that the invaders' greatest weakness was time itself. In Operation Anaconda, the U.S. tried to prove them wrong. Thousands of troops swept into the Shah-e-Kot Valley, hunting al-Qaeda remnants. The operation was meant to be decisive, fast, lethal, final. Instead, it became a mirror of every war fought in these mountains. Helicopters were shot down, soldiers pinned by enemy fire, the terrain turning each step into exhaustion. Airstrikes shattered the ridges but revealed nothing. When the smoke cleared, hundreds of insurgents were dead, but so were dozens of coalition troops. Bin Laden was not among them. The valley had swallowed another victory whole. In Washington, officials spoke of success with lessons learned. On the ground, those lessons were written in blood. American commanders realized that air power alone could not win a war built on faith and endurance. Villagers offered smiles by day and resistance by night. Every raid meant new enemies. Every mistake meant a new martyr. The Americans were learning too late that Afghanistan could not be conquered by precision, only survive through endurance. Karzai's government struggled to project control. Ministers squabbled over ministries, warlords carved out personal kingdoms, and the line between ally and adversary blurred daily. In Kandahar, the poppy fields bloomed again, funding both sides of the conflict. The same fields that fed families now financed insurgents. It was a cruel symmetry, destruction and livelihood intertwined in the soil. As summer turned to autumn, soldiers returning home called it a different kind of war. Not one of front lines, but of circles. Patrols found themselves fighting the same villages again and again, each victory undone by time. Afghanistan seemed to absorb every wound without bleeding out. In Kabul, a journalist asked a U.S. general how long the mission would last. The man smiled, tired but polite. "As long as it takes," he said. In a village not far from coast, a farmer stood among the ruins of his house, destroyed by a bomb meant for someone else. He picked up a fragment of shrapnel, still warm, and turned it in his hand. Around him, the wind moved through the wheat, carrying the echo of distant engines. For him, the war had no name, no victory, and no end, only the sound of planes returning to the sky. By 2003, the banners of victory had already begun to fray. The Taliban were gone from power, yet Afghanistan felt no safer. What remained was a fragile state stitched together by foreign ambition and local necessity. The Americans called it nation building. To many Afghans, it looked like reconstruction built on dust. In Kabul, cranes and scaffolds rose beside shattered buildings. Aid money poured in by the billions, and with it came consultants, contractors, and advisors. A parade of languages, logos, and well-intentioned confusion. On paper, progress was measurable. Schools reopened, roads repaired, elections planned. But beneath the numbers, the old fractures endured. Provinces loyal to their own warlords obeyed Kabul only when paid to. The new national army was still a patchwork of former militias, soldiers who had fought one another only a few years before. President Hamid Karzai, charismatic yet cautious, walked a tightrope. To survive, he balanced tribal loyalty against foreign expectation. The Americans praised his eloquence, his tailored suits, his calm speeches about democracy. But outside the capital, his name carried less weight than that of any local commander. He ruled a government whose power extended as far as the range of its radios. For ordinary Afghans, hope was a fragile habit. In the bazaars of Kandahar, merchants sold American batteries next to Soviet ammunition. Children learned English phrases in newly built classrooms but fetched water from wells older than their grandfathers. The war had changed everything and nothing at once. Meanwhile, U.S. attention was drifting. Iraq dominated headlines and strategy meetings. Resources thinned, focus shifted, and Afghanistan slipped into the background, a success story that no one wanted to re-examine too closely. Commanders on the ground warned of growing Taliban movements across the border in Pakistan, but Washington heard only the echo of its own optimism. "The mission is accomplished," one official said. "We are moving forward." Across the border, the Taliban were indeed moving forward, rebuilding with quiet precision. They opened madrasas, recruited the young, and rebuilt their networks under the protection of sympathetic tribes. The sanctuary they found there would one day become the spine of their return. But in 2003, the West mistook their silence for surrender. In Helmand, fields of poppies shimmered pink under the sun. The opium trade, once suppressed, had become Afghanistan's new economy, a harvest more reliable than aid. Everyone profited, from local farmers to provincial police. Corruption seeped into every promise. Soldiers guarding convoys one week were escorting smugglers the next. That summer, as coalition forces patrolled the dusty roads outside coast, roadside bombs began to appear again, crude, improvised, and devastating. The first ambushes were written off as isolated acts. Then came the pattern: an explosion, a withdrawal, a silence. The insurgency was no longer rebuilding, it was returning. In Kabul, Karzai met with U.S. generals and insisted the problem was temporary, remnants of the old regime. But as night fell, he looked out over the dark city from the palace balcony. The generators hummed, the streets were empty. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the war he had inherited was stirring again. In the quiet distance, a single explosion rolled through the valley, faint, distant, inevitable. Karzai didn't flinch. He only whispered to his aide, "That was not the last." And it wasn't. By 2004, the Taliban were no longer a memory. They were a rumor taking shape again. Whispers spread through border villages. The emirate will return. In tea houses and markets, men spoke of fighters reappearing in the south, of weapons smuggled through the passes, of night letters slipped under doors warning officials to choose sides. The Americans dismissed it as fear, the government as gossip. But in Afghanistan, rumors had a way of becoming history. In the deserts of Helmand and Kandahar, the remnants of the old regime gathered quietly. Commanders who had once fled across the border began to return, first as traders, then as preachers, then as leaders again. They moved with discipline and patience, unarmed by day, armed by night. The Taliban didn't need to take cities. They needed only to remind people that they had never truly left. The Americans, stretched thin and distracted by Iraq, were unprepared for the shift. Their patrols still moved confidently through villages, handing out notebooks and medicine, believing they were winning hearts and minds. But the hearts had already begun to turn. The drone of helicopters, once a symbol of power, now meant intrusion. The promise of democracy felt distant, the presence of foreign troops, immediate. In Pakistan, the Taliban leadership, now based in Quetta, rebuilt their hierarchy. They called it the Quetta Shura, a council of exiles planning an insurgency that would outlast the invaders. Mullah Omar, unseen but still revered, issued decrees through couriers. His message was clear: patience, faith, and endurance. The Americans have the watches, he said again, but we have the time. In Kabul, President Hamid Karzai announced Afghanistan's first democratic election. Banners hung from government buildings, foreign observers arrived, and international media declared it a historic moment. Millions of Afghans voted, some walking miles through minefields to cast their ballots. Karzai won, hailed as a unifying figure. But beyond the celebration, the Taliban watched and learned. They saw that Kabul's power depended on foreign protection, and that protection was not infinite. By late 2004, the insurgency was spreading like cracks through ice. Roadside bombs, IEDs, became the new face of war. Cheap, invisible, and devastating, they turned every convoy into a gamble. Soldiers adapted, adding armor, then heavier armor, but no amount of steel could defend against uncertainty. Each explosion erased another illusion of control. In villages, foreign troops were no longer seen as liberators. Their raids grew more aggressive, their intelligence more desperate. Innocent men were detained, homes searched, elders humiliated. For every insurgent captured, 2 more were created. The Taliban didn't need to fight every battle. They only needed to let their enemies make mistakes. That winter, American strategists began to notice something troubling. The attacks weren't random anymore. They were coordinated, precise, and spreading south to north. It was no longer an echo of the old Taliban. It was their resurrection. In Kandahar, a farmer returned to his field one morning to find a white flag planted among his poppies. There was no writing on it, just the silence of recognition. He stared at it for a long time before turning away, knowing what it meant. The war that everyone said was over had come back home. That night, in the dark, the flag fluttered in the wind, pale, quiet, and unbroken. By 2005, Afghanistan was living between 2 fictions: peace declared by the powerful, and war remembered by everyone else. On the surface, the Taliban were gone. Democracy was taking shape, and foreign aid poured in like a river. But beneath that fragile image, the same patterns returned: corruption, division, and exhaustion. The guns were quieter, yet the fear had simply changed its uniform. In Kabul, the embassies gleamed behind concrete blast walls. Diplomats spoke in the language of optimism, progress, development, reconstruction. Convoys of armored SUVs roared through streets lined with children selling plastic flags. Each meeting ended with promises. Each promise began with conditions. To the city's poor, democracy was something they saw behind tinted glass. To the foreign contractors, it was an industry. Beyond the capital, reality eroded faster. Roads built by American money were already breaking apart, their asphalt cracked by weather and neglect. Villages that had once welcomed NATO troops now watched them warily. The government's reach ended where its paperwork did. Governors ruled as warlords, police extorted bribes as routine. The Afghan flag flew, but it no longer meant ownership, only presence. The Taliban, regrouping across the border, had learned from defeat. They returned not as conquerors, but as shadows. Their fighters moved in small groups, their weapons buried until nightfall. They no longer tried to hold land. They tried to hold belief. Their message spread through madrasas and mosques. The foreigners will leave. The emirate will return. To those who felt betrayed by corruption and humiliation, that message sounded like memory. Inside the U.S. bases, frustration grew. Each patrol blurred into the next. Soldiers fought to take the same roads, the same villages, the same hills, again and again. Reports still spoke of progress, but it was progress that bled. They were winning the statistics, losing the reality. One sergeant wrote in his journal, "We build schools by day, then bomb the same villages at night. No one trusts us, and maybe they shouldn't." Karzai's government, trapped between dependence and pride, struggled to claim authority. His officials wore Western suits but governed like the old kings, trading favors, securing loyalty with money and fear. Corruption was no longer an accident, it was the system. And with every dollar that vanished, the Taliban story sounded more believable. Meanwhile, in the southern provinces, the war returned in fragments: ambushes, bombings, assassinations. Each event was small enough to be ignored, but together they formed a rhythm. Afghanistan was slipping back into the song it had never stopped singing. By the end of 2005, the illusion was breaking. Aid money slowed, foreign interest waned, and the headlines turned elsewhere. The West congratulated itself for bringing peace. Afghans buried their dead quietly. In a village near Zabul, a boy and his father repaired the wall of their house, shattered by an old explosion. As they worked, they could hear a convoy passing in the distance, engines rumbling like thunder on dry ground. The boy asked, "Will they come back?" The father looked up from the dust. "Everyone comes back," he said. "Only the names change." The engines faded and the valley returned to silence. The peace that remained was not victory, only the pause between wars. By 2006, Afghanistan no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like a fortress. Concrete walls rose around every embassy, every base, every government office. Helicopters shuttled officials above streets too dangerous to walk. The war that had begun as liberation was hardening into occupation. And for those who lived beneath its shadows, the difference between the two had vanished. In Kabul, the skyline hummed with foreign ambition. Billboards advertised reconstruction projects funded by nations half a world away. Yet behind the slogans, Afghans watched as the money built walls instead of homes. Electricity flickered, jobs disappeared, and the city's new luxury hotels stood half empty, guarded by men who earned more in a week than local teachers made in a year. Progress had arrived, but it spoke another language and carried a rifle. Beyond the capital, the illusion of peace was already cracking. In Helmand and Kandahar, the Taliban were returning, no longer as soldiers, but as phantoms. They moved at night, slipping through fields and rivers, spreading messages instead of fire. Villagers who had once turned them away now listened. The Americans promised stability, the Taliban promised justice. In a land where promises were cheap, justice, even brutal justice, had value. The NATO mission expanded that year, bringing new uniforms and new flags. British, Canadian, Dutch, and German troops arrived with doctrines of stability and reconstruction. They built schools, dug wells, held meetings with tribal elders. But by nightfall, many of those elders were dead. The Taliban left notes pinned to their doors. Collaborators will not wake to see the dawn. And in the morning, NATO soldiers would return to the same villages, wondering why no one spoke to them anymore. President Hamid Karzai tried to steady the illusion. He wore Western suits and spoke of unity, but his grip on power was slipping through the cracks of corruption. His government was riddled with former warlords, men whose loyalty could be bought but never trusted. He appealed for patience, for understanding, for partnership. But outside the city walls, his speeches carried no echo. "The Americans call him a president," one villager said, "but he governs less than a king's shadow." The war, once clean and righteous, had turned into something shapeless. Convoys rolled out each morning to clear and hold, but by nightfall, the same territory belonged to the enemy again. Every success was temporary, every death permanent. Soldiers learned the rhythm: patrol, contact, explosion, silence. It was not a war of conquest or defense. It was a war of repetition. In Washington, Afghanistan was becoming an afterthought. Iraq demanded headlines, resources, and rage. Afghanistan, quieter and slower, became the good war, the one that could wait. But wars that wait tend to grow. As attention drifted, the Taliban rebuilt with patience that no superpower could match. That autumn, a British officer wrote home from Helmand, "We are not fighting an army. We are fighting a ghost that knows our schedule." And in the countryside, the ghost waited. Fields turned gold under the setting sun, and from somewhere unseen came the faint crack of gunfire, a reminder that in Afghanistan, peace was just another front line. As the evening call to prayer echoed through the valleys, villagers extinguished their lamps early, afraid to be seen. The sky above was filled with the hum of helicopters circling the dark, chasing movement that would not stand still. The occupation had begun, not declared, but felt. By 2007, the Taliban were no longer a rumor. They were a rhythm. The ambushes, the explosions, the assassinations, each came with a steady pulse that beat through the south and east of Afghanistan. For the first time since their fall, the Taliban were on the offensive. They didn't march in columns or hold cities. They didn't need to. They moved like weather, unseen until they struck, unstoppable once they did. In the Helmand and Kandahar provinces, NATO convoys rolled through the same villages again and again, fighting for ground that never stayed won. Every new outpost became a target. Every road paved turned into an ambush route. The insurgency had learned to make the occupation itself the battlefield. They didn't challenge power. They drained it. The U.S. called it counterinsurgency. But to the soldiers on the ground, it felt like an endless loop. Patrols left the wire each morning under the same pale light, scanning for hidden bombs that cost $20 to make, but millions to defend against. The rhythm of the war was cruel math. One step, one explosion, one silence. Each day reset to zero. The Taliban's message spread faster than any army could move. They promised revenge for the bombings, honor for the humiliated, and justice where government corruption had left none. They didn't recruit. They remembered. Young men who had been boys during the invasion were now fighters themselves. They knew the terrain, the languages, and the patience that foreign armies lacked. In Kabul, the illusion of control grew thinner. President Hamid Karzai watched as his government fractured under the weight of bribes and betrayal. Ministries turned into marketplaces, and loyalty was priced in dollars. To many Afghans, democracy had become a business, expensive, inaccessible, and foreign. They promised us a nation, one teacher said, but all we got were offices. The Americans tried to adapt. They sent more troops, more technology, more promises. Drones hovered over valleys day and night, their hum constant as the wind. Yet for every strike that hit its target, another created new enemies. Civilian death spread like cracks through faith in the mission. In a single village, a wedding was mistaken for a gathering of insurgents. The blast killed dozens. By morning, the survivors buried their dead and swore allegiance to the Taliban. Even the weather seemed to choose sides. Summer dust blinded convoys, winter snow grounded aircraft. Time itself moved differently. Slow for the occupiers, patient for the insurgents. "We have the watches," a U.S. general said, echoing a familiar phrase, "but they still have the time." In Helmand, a NATO base stood surrounded by fields of opium poppies, the country's new gold. The same farmers who sold their harvests to warlords by day carried rifles for the Taliban by night. The Americans sprayed the crops, hoping to cut off funding. The farmers starved instead. The war had begun to eat its own logic. By year's end, the Taliban's flag was once again seen in parts of Uruzgan and Zabul. White cloths fluttered quietly over villages, not as conquest but as warning. The foreign soldiers came, left, and came again. The villagers stayed, as they always had, waiting to see who would last longer. One evening near Sangin, an American patrol returned from another mission, tired, dust-covered, unhurt. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a single explosion echoed in the distance, followed by another, then another. The soldiers froze, listening. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. The insurgency was no longer returning. It was already home. By 2008, Afghanistan had become a landscape of repetition. The same villages fought over, the same roads rebuilt and destroyed, the same promises made and forgotten. Maps changed weekly, yet the terrain never did. For every district claimed as secured, another slipped quietly into Taliban hands. The Americans had technology, the Taliban had time, and the mountains belonged to neither. In Helmand, the British fought a war that could not be seen. They patrolled through fields of opium poppies taller than men, where every mound of dirt might conceal an explosive. They built bases from shipping containers and sandbags, naming them with optimism: Camp Hope, Camp Eagle, Camp Justice. The names lasted longer than the outposts. By nightfall, the Taliban returned to plant bombs under the same walls raised that morning. The NATO coalition expanded, bringing in new uniforms and new doctrines. Each ally arrived with a different language, a different rule of engagement, and the same confusion. Generals spoke of winning hearts and minds, but the only hearts they met were tired, and the only minds they changed were their own. A soldier could spend 6 months building trust in a village, only to see it vanish overnight after one airstrike gone wrong. The war had become a pendulum, every swing erasing the last. President Hamid Karzai, once hailed as the face of democracy, now ruled from isolation. Surrounded by Western advisors and corrupt ministers, he tried to hold together a government that existed mostly on paper. His speeches grew angrier, accusing the Americans of arrogance and his own people of betrayal. "They call me president," he said once, "but I'm only a mayor of Kabul." Beyond the city's checkpoints, the countryside belonged to whoever could pay, pray, or kill for it. Meanwhile, across the border in Pakistan, the Taliban's leadership, the Quetta Shura, operated openly. Their commanders moved between mosques and markets, recruiting new fighters faster than NATO could eliminate them. The U.S. responded with drones, sleek machines that watched from the sky and struck without warning. The attacks killed their targets, but also their families, their neighbors, their children. For every militant destroyed, 3 more swore vengeance. Inside the bases, soldiers adapted to the illusion of progress. They measured success in patrols completed, missions logged, insurgents neutralized. But in their private journals, they wrote something else. About villages they couldn't find on maps, about locals who smiled by day and vanished by night, about a war where victory meant living until morning. "We're not winning," one Marine wrote. "We're rotating." The Taliban no longer sought to capture cities. They didn't need to. They owned the nights. Their fighters moved through the dark like smoke, laying explosives, delivering letters, settling debts. Their rule was invisible but absolute. In some districts, the government still paid salaries, directly to men who also carried Taliban rifles. By year's end, NATO generals declared the situation challenging but improving. The numbers said so. Enemy casualties, districts stabilized, schools reopened. Yet every statistic was a shadow of something else. A raid, a bombing, a funeral. The illusion of control held, fragile, convincing, and false. One evening near Kandahar, a convoy rolled past a burned-out vehicle, its metal twisted like paper. Inside the truck was still a child's toy, a small plastic horse half melted from the blast. A soldier picked it up, brushed off the dust, and left it on a stone wall before walking away. The desert wind knocked it over moments later. And somewhere beyond the hills, another explosion echoed, a sound that no longer surprised anyone. By 2009, Afghanistan was no longer a campaign. It was a condition. The war had outlasted the promises, the presidents, and the patience of everyone involved. New generals arrived with new strategies, speaking of fresh momentum and revised counterinsurgency, as if language itself could conquer exhaustion. But to the soldiers on the ground, nothing felt new. The faces changed. The war did not. In Helmand, Marines fought for towns with names few could pronounce. Marja, now Zad, Sangin, places that would appear briefly on maps before fading back into anonymity. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, a shadow that followed every footstep. Patrols moved in slow, deliberate rhythm. Step, scan, listen, wait. The most dangerous sound was silence. General Stanley McChrystal arrived in Kabul with a doctrine built on patience. He banned airstrikes near civilian areas, emphasized protecting people over killing enemies, and ordered his troops to fight less like conquerors and more like guests. It was noble in theory, impossible in practice. For every restraint shown by day, an IED exploded by night. For every village secured, another turned hostile. Winning hearts and minds meant first surviving them. In Kandahar, the Taliban adjusted with equal precision. They no longer fought for control, they fought for inevitability. They taxed opium farmers, settled disputes, and ran shadow courts that delivered swift, brutal justice. Justice that worked, at least by local standards. For villagers, it was the only form of order left. "The government's laws are in Kabul," one elder said, "but the Taliban's laws are here." Meanwhile, the United States poured in reinforcements. President Barack Obama announced a surge of 30,000 troops. A final push, he promised, to turn the tide. Bases multiplied across the south, each one a small island of order in an ocean of chaos. From the air, Afghanistan looked covered in light. On the ground, those lights flickered and died as quickly as they appeared. For Afghans, hope became an act of endurance. Families rebuilt homes knowing they might soon lose them again. Children went to school under the echo of nearby gunfire. The presence of foreigners was now routine, like weather, sometimes helpful, sometimes deadly. In villages where Americans handed out aid by day, Taliban recruiters visited by night. Every interaction carried risk. Every word could be fatal. Among the troops, fatigue became a kind of faith. They joked about rotations, not victories. They learned that the war was not about winning, but continuing. Letters home spoke of routines rather than missions. Patrols, chow, sleep, repeat. "We are farmers of security," one soldier wrote, "planting seeds that never grow." In Kabul, the politics mirrored the battlefield, stagnant, cynical, circular. Elections were marred by fraud. Alliances shifted like desert wind. Hamid Karzai, re-elected amid controversy, grew increasingly defiant toward his American backers. "This is our war," he declared, "and our country." But outside the capital, neither statement was true. By the year's end, the war had lasted longer than World War II and Vietnam combined. To a generation of Afghans, it was not a conflict. It was life. To a generation of Americans, it was background noise. The words "support our troops" had replaced "end the war." One night near Marja, a squad of Marines sat beneath the stars, their rifles stacked beside them. The radio crackled with another distant report, another blast, another casualty. No one spoke. Above them, the Milky Way stretched across the sky, vast and indifferent. The young lieutenant broke the silence. "Do you think it ever ends?" he asked. An older sergeant exhaled smoke into the dark. "Everything ends," he said. "Just not here." By 2010, Afghanistan had entered a strange kind of permanence, a war that no longer needed to be justified, only maintained. The foreign bases dotted the map like constellations, each one repeating the same mission orders that had been written years before. Generals spoke of transition and exit strategy, but everyone on the ground knew the truth. The war had become its own reason to exist. In Kandahar, a soldier could walk through a village for the 5th time in 2 years and find it exactly as before. The same cracked walls, the same wary faces, the same silence after greetings. Children waved by reflex, adults watched by memory. Between them lay the ghost of 1,000 promises. "We're here to help," the soldier said. But help had come too many times and stayed too long. The Taliban no longer hid. Their white flags reappeared across the south, fluttering quietly over villages that NATO claimed to control. They didn't announce their return. They simply resumed it. Their strength was not in victory, but in duration. "The Americans have the watches," one fighter said again, "but we have the time." It had become more than a slogan. It was a law of nature. In Kabul, President Hamid Karzai grew weary of the role history had assigned him. His speeches turned bitter, his trust in his allies thin. Corruption scandals stained his government, but it no longer shocked anyone. Western officials spoke privately of withdrawal. Afghans spoke quietly of survival. Between them, faith in the future had dissolved. American drones filled the skies now, an invisible empire of eyes. They hovered over mountains and villages, tracking movements, waiting for permission. The strikes were precise, clinical, and merciless. Each one eliminated an enemy, a family, or both. The war had become a matter of coordinates. Somewhere in Nevada, a pilot pushed a button, and a continent away, another generation of Afghans learned the sound of judgment. In the Korangal Valley, soldiers built and abandoned the same outposts again and again. "We don't take ground," one lieutenant said. "We borrow it." When they finally left, the Taliban moved back in within hours, as if the mountains themselves had exhaled them. Nothing stayed conquered, nothing stayed safe. The West spoke of progress. Schools reopened, women elected, roads rebuilt. But the progress lived only in reports and photographs. On the ground, those same schools burned, those same roads cracked, and those same women fled for safety once the cameras left. What had begun as a campaign to defeat terror had become a cycle of endurance, faith, and forgetting. By 2011, the world's attention shifted again. Another name replaced Afghanistan's in the headlines: bin Laden, found and killed in Pakistan. Crowds cheered, politicians spoke of closure. But for the soldiers in the valleys, nothing changed. The enemy remained, the mission remained, the war remained. The ghost had never been one man. In a small village near Ghazni, a boy no older than 10 watched a convoy of American Humvees roll past his house. The engines rattled, kicking up a cloud of dust that coated everything: walls, trees, faces. The boy turned to his mother and asked, "When will they leave?" She looked at the vehicles disappearing into the haze, then back at her son. "Everyone leaves," she said softly, "but the war stays." As the dust settled, the road was empty again, stretching into the horizon. A road that had seen too many armies, too many flags, too many endings that never ended. And in the quiet that followed, Afghanistan waited. Not for peace, but for whatever would come next.